Hello and welcome to the Theorem podcast. I'm Aspasia and I'm here to shed light on contemporary wisdom and knowledge and suggest feasible ways they can be incorporated into our lives. The podcast today is about stepping into our power, overcoming our biases, and a lot more. My guest at Theorem today is Bron Williams. As a woman in leadership across the fields of education and nonprofit for more than 30 years, Bron Williams has taught a multi grade classroom, led a school, ran a Salvation Army church and welfare center, and worked with asylum seekers on Nauru. It was working with asylum seekers and alongside Pacific Islanders that alerted Bron to her own latent bias of racism, and she understood her white privilege for the first time. In her personal life, Braun has shattered family and cultural expectations around what a woman should do, challenged societal norms about what aging looks like, and reformed and reshaped her career not once, but twice. She knows it takes courage to let go of long held beliefs that hold us back, to lead from behind when leadership is not recognized, and to set up and run businesses in fresh ways. Braun is a trained educator, holds an honors degree in theology, and is currently undertaking PhD research exploring the intersection of bias and shame. Hello and welcome to Theorem, dear Braun. I feel very fortunate for having you on. How are you doing today?
I'm doing really well, Aspasia. It's a beautiful morning here in Australia.
So let's jump in. You have done and you're still doing amazing things, interesting and meaningful. When you were younger, did you have any idea of what would follow? Was there an inner voice? Was there an indication of what would follow?
No. Short answer, no. And I do believe that's the same for all of our lives. We can have ideas and dreams, I think, as children that we follow. And I certainly did. At the age of 8, I decided I wanted to be a teacher. And I did follow that course and trained as an educator. But it's only been recently, in the last 2 or 3 months, that I realised that perhaps part of that decision, that desire to be a teacher, was that I'd grown up in a very conservative Christian home, and the voices of authority were all men. You know, my dad, um, and the men in the church. You know, listening to sermons on Sunday, and I realise now that teaching was an area in which I saw women lead. As an
Mm.
8-year-old, you can't make those cognitive connections. But I realise now that this was probably the only place as a child that I saw women taking leadership. And I have always been a leader. You don't know that at 8 years old, but it is part of you. And so I think that's probably, even as a little one, I recognised this was a way I could be a leader. And I know I have a natural gift for teaching as well. So the two collided in a wonderful way.
Wow. And well, you've done so many things after that. Could you please um, tell us about what led to what and what brought you here today?
Oh, wonderful. I love connecting the dots, and connecting the dots in my life has been, well, revelatory, I think, because as we go through life, we literally do just step from stepping stone to stepping stone. You know, what opens up in front of us, and it's only as we get older, and I have quite a few decades under my belt now, that you can look back and connect some of those dots. So, certainly, that 8-year-old finished high school, did really well at school. I loved school. Loved learning, and I still love learning. Hence, doing the PhD. And so I went and trained at in a teachers' college. I did not want to go to university. By the time I'd finished my high school certificate, which is the highest level of high school education here, um, I thought I don't want to do anything more strenuous than that. So I went off to teachers' college, studied for 3 years, and then became a trained teacher. But what I did was, even though I loved teaching, because of my conservative background, I had seen my mum be a mum. In the 1950s, she'd had to give up work when she got married. She was not allowed to continue working in the Commonwealth Bank here in Australia once she married. So I saw that as the norm. Well, I want to be like my mum and go and be a mum. So I only taught for about 3 or 4 years, stopped, had a family, did a whole lot of casual teaching uh, for probably the next 15 years or so before my children, I have three sons, the youngest started school. And that's when I thought, oh, maybe I can do some full time work. And that's when I took on the role in the multi-grade classroom in a small Christian school where two of my sons were going. And I realised then that I had all the skills I needed for teaching, a number of different grades in one room from doing all the casual teaching that I'd done. As a casual teacher, you go in and for a day and you might teach sixth grade today and you'll teach kindergarten tomorrow. And here I was having all of these grades in the one room. And so I felt as though after years of being the understudy, standing in the wings, I was now the prima donna, dancing on the stage. And it was in that situation at that Christian school that I was principal uh, just for a year, in their final year of the school before it closed. So I was involved in a lot of things that perhaps principals don't get involved in bringing a school to a close. And it was after that, and during the time after that, my marriage broke down, and I was the one who walked away. And we might talk a bit more about why that happened. And it was then that I went in my second career, which was with the Salvation Army. And I trained with them, became an ordained minister. So I was able to marry people, and I did. I married a couple, two couples. I was able to dedicate babies, do funerals, and as strange as it may seem, I loved doing funerals because they were times in which people who I did not know let me into their lives. I just had this window, and they were open to telling me so much about their families, about their loved one, and to be able to facilitate that final farewell, I felt was a huge privilege. And
Mm-hmm.
so just loved that. Had a number of roles with the Salvation Army, one of which took me to Nauru, working with asylum seekers when the federal government here in Australia reopened the offshore processing. And then after that role finished, and it was life changing. We use that cliche often, but for me, it did change the course of my life. And I ended up in Melbourne, where I live now, and at the ripe old age of 60, decided now was the time to follow a path of my own making. And so that's what I've been doing for the last 6 years, following a path of my own making. What do I want to do in this third act of my life? And now I'm working with women, plugging them back into their power.
Wow. Wow. If you don't mind me asking about that first part, about that time when you decided to leave your marriage and change your career at the same time. It is a time that for most women, um, they are in fear, that they're hesitant to take that step. And it's for most, as far as I know, is a step that they eventually don't take. And you mentioned that you did two steps at once: the leaving marriage and also changing your career. How did that come about?
That's a really good question. I hadn't actually connected those dots as to how quickly I did those two things. Because when you're in the throes of life changing events. You literally are just going, I'll take the next step, I'll take the next step, I'll take the next step. So for me, leaving the marriage was something, well, like I understand for most people who leave a marriage, it's not something you make a decision overnight and then you just get up one morning and go, I've had enough. It was probably, for me, 4 years of thinking this through. And I really didn't know why I was leaving. I just knew I couldn't stay any longer. I'd tried to make the marriage work. I'd been quite unhappy, deeply, not crying unhappy, but just a deep sadness within for maybe 10, even 15 years. But because of my faith background, divorce was just not an option. We'd been told, my ex husband and I, the only pre marriage counselling we'd been given was don't get divorced. Well, I took that to heart. And so ended up, we were married for 28 years. So it was a good stretch. But I left not knowing why, just knowing I couldn't stay. And it was in the next few years that I began to recognize that my husband's passive aggressive way of behaving was actually abusive. As a good friend of mine has said, passive aggression is still aggression. Yeah, there's
Hmm.
no blows, there's no shouts, but the pain that is caused by those and the wounding is as deep and hard to heal because you don't even see it until a little, just a little trigger, and you go, "Oh, that hurts." So I realise now why I left, but I left because I couldn't stay. And it was probably 2 years. So it wasn't quite at the same time, but it was still pretty much within the same time that I had the opportunity to join the Salvation Army, having been, or, being a church being a focal centre of my life and my social life. Leaving the marriage, I actually ended up leaving the church where we both attended because it was just awkward.
Oh.
Sitting in the church on Sunday, but not sitting together. So, and I went over to the Salvos, and they really welcomed me with open arms. And it was suggested by then that perhaps I do retrain with them. And that ticked all the boxes for me because I loved speaking, I loved communicating, and this gave me the opportunity to do a degree, which I hadn't done in my 20s. Here I was in my 50s, and I jumped at the chance. So, yeah, so how did I do all that in one go? Again, I think because I used to describe myself like a little frog in a pond, just hopping from one rock to the next. I could not see the other side of the pond, but I I can still remember clearly those days where I'd wake up and go, okay, I wonder what next rock will appear today. So I think I had a sense of curiosity of thinking, where am I going? And um, because I had an understanding of God and that God would lead me, I was actually
Hmm.
looking. I think I was looking for the next thing. And having made this huge break, which was to get out of my marriage, like that was the biggest thing I've ever done in my life because it had been reinforced in me for so long. The sanctity of marriage, that you do not break those bonds, even though I had really good reasons to break them. Having made that decision, and the sky didn't fall in, I still realised that I thought God was still leading me. It was like, then, okay, well, I can do other maybe big things as well.
Wow. Okay. And what you just described, focusing on the next rock, um, is a bit different from what I had as an image in my mind, which was, I think of women being afraid of leaving their situation. And it's this that they focus on, the rock they're on. How am I going to leave this? Not, they're not focusing on what's next, or what could be next. They're just afraid of what could be next, without, like, they have blinders, they cannot see it, they don't want to see it. And at the same time, they're afraid of leaving, the rock they're on. And what is your take on this?
Mm. I think you're quite accurate because I had considered leaving my husband probably 10 years prior to when eventually did. But my youngest was only 2 at that time, and I was definitely in that situation that you described. Not happy, not knowing the marriage was dysfunctional, but not knowing what to do to fix it. But then thinking I have 3 sons, so the youngest was 2, so there would have been 2, 9, and 13. So I have a bit of a gap between my children. But I would have thought they would come with me. I thought about my parents. I thought they won't understand why I want to go. I thought, where do I go as a mum with 3 children who has only ever done casual teaching? I don't have a full time job. How would I get a house? What would I do for work? And I came back to the point of I'm unhappy, but my leaving will make my children unhappy, and I knew it would make my husband unhappy, so I stayed. So I certainly understand that, and I will never condemn a woman who stays because it is hard. Like I've when I sat opposite my husband and said to him, I'm leaving, and he said no, I'm literally holding my hands together in my lap, and I said yes. I believe that's the bravest thing I've ever done in my life because I was in that moment shattering all my own dreams, but also shattering the expectations of me as a Christian woman, Christian mother, Christian wife. I was going, bang, this is done. And so I will never condemn a woman who stays because I know that looking for the next rock can sometimes be really, really hard. But I can only think that I was ready to leave and I
Hmm.
couldn't stay anymore. So staying was harder than the unknown of going.
And what did that experience teach you?
Oh, do you know, no one has ever asked me that question. Thank you. What I believe, because I really feel my life has been in 2 parts, because I left my ex-husband at 50. And in the Bible, 50 years is a jubilee year. It's a year of renewal, of when land can lie fallow, when debts are cancelled. So it's like a new beginning. So for
Hmm.
me, turning 50, I knew was going to be an amazing year. And I don't know whether even sort of subconsciously I knew this and thought, okay, this is the time to do it. But what did it teach me? What I have learnt since then probably is the best way I can answer it is that I am stronger beyond measure. And I feel myself getting emotional as I say this, so I know this is deep and true. I am stronger beyond measure than I thought. People have said to me over and over again, Bron, you have so much courage. And I often respond, sometimes there's no other choice. And that's how I felt, is that courage is often just taking that step onto the next rock because the staying is too hard, where you are is too difficult. Moving forward is the only thing to do. And I do believe that we can all move forward. And yes, it is scary. And yes, it takes courage, but I do believe coming back to that essence of knowing that I'm stronger beyond measure than I ever believed, um, it's only in the doing often that we discover our strength. And that's why now, because I know I'm just an ordinary woman. And if I have discovered this strength and power within me, that was hidden by, really covered over by the expectations of my faith background, my family. I know other women are exactly the same. They are powerful beyond measure, and I want to help them tap into their own power.
Hmm. I'd like to take a second to take this in because I loved it. I love it. Um, and I think it this is such an optimistic and encouraging message to anyone hearing it. Because it's not just women, it's anyone, really.
Yes.
Everybody, all of us, I think we are afraid of the unknown. We're afraid to step into the unknown. And we feel so much safer um, following the norm and what's expected and what everybody else around us is doing. Yeah, feels a safer choice. And yes, and I think that sometimes even doing that requires so much strength because it's not what our heart wants. And enduring it is something that takes a lot of energy. And it takes energy to overlook, the voice of the heart.
Yes.
Um,
If I could pick up on that, Aspasia, just recently, like in the last week, a friend of mine has taught me a new technique or process where I was concerned about something, and I'm sure it's the same across the world. I had flights booked, and then Qantas changed them on me. And I thought, I don't like these new flights. So, nothing life changing, but annoying. And I was talking with my friend about this, and she said, just take a moment, get out of your head. And she said, just, be in your heart. So I literally placed my hand over my heart and allowed myself to stop. And of course, when you get out of your head and stop the busy thoughts, which only causes anxiety, of course, then I became calmer. And I thought, oh, this is wonderful. And all the busy, anxious thoughts didn't seem so important because they were allowed to drift away. And I'm using that technique now. I say to myself, stay in your heart, Bron. When my head, and this, we come back to, say a woman leaving a difficult situation, or any of us leaving a difficult situation. It doesn't have to be a difficult marriage, it can be a difficult work situation, a breakdown in a friendship, whatever it is. Our head, which is a wonderful part of our body, our brain, but it's the bit that does all the busy thoughts where all the anxiety dwells. And, we catastrophize about all the what ifs, what if, and we have all these scenarios. But when we can take a moment, and it has to be intentional, you take a moment and you stay in our heart, because then you can listen to what your heart, and that's what I loved what you had to say. Listen to what your heart has to say. And just going back to my changing flights with Qantas, I went back to my travel agent, and on the way, I'm saying, stay in your heart, stay in your heart, ask your heart what you want. Of course, my heart wanted to have not flights in the middle of the night, flights during the daytime. So, going into the meeting with my travel agent, knowing what my heart wanted, guess what? I got what my heart wanted. And so it's just little things, but I've even done that this morning. I've said, Bron, I've said to my heart, what does my heart want out of this podcast? And I think I'm finding it's a very good process to take, because our brains, our minds will give us 1,000 scenarios, and rarely do we latch on to the positive ones. We latch on to all the negative ones, all the drama that can happen. But our heart knows what we really want. And so we do need to stay connected to it.
hmm. I want to take that in too. I love it too. Um, and the first thing, the little voice here says, so what if what you think that your heart says is your ego? you know?
I like your little voice. Yeah, don't we all have those voices?
Yeah. My little voice is a little, smarty and a little bitchy. And she is, she wants to be heard. And yeah.
Yeah, she does want to be heard. And unfortunately, we do listen to those voices in our heads far too often.
Hmm.
Because and I think coming back to something that you'd said in the introduction about doing businesses in different ways,
Hmm.
one of my, I have what I call my core principles: collaboration, organic, reach and growth, resonance, and equilibrium. That second one of organic, in these last 6 years, I've been part of different coaching groups, learning things, because business is not something that I have been involved in the past. So I've had to learn a lot. And in some of those groups, there's been a real focus on the hustle, on the head, make the plan, set the goal, work back from there with all the steps. And I kept thinking, I get this in my head, but my heart was telling me that there is another way to do business. And
Hmm.
so this whole thing about organic, what comes to me as I reach out. It's not just I'm sitting here in my little room in Melbourne, Australia, and expecting the world to come to me. I've literally got to be out talking with people. But what comes to me, what resonates with my heart, those are the things that I'm wanting to follow up. And even me and you meeting now is because we both know Sue Tiong in Malaysia. And I met Sue in America. She'd gone to the US and I'd gone to the US, and we sat next to each other, with me and her, and the three of us with her husband. Now that's organic. We both had to
Hmm.
buy our tickets to the conference and turn up and pay our. So we still had to do that work. But the organic thing was the three of us sat together, and because of that, Sue reached out to me and said, "I think you'd be good for Aspasia's podcast." That's what I'm talking about: listening to your heart, doing business in an organic way
Hmm.
rather than the hustle and grind.
Yeah. And our culture is so much about hustling all the time. And I observe it in me that sometimes I the more I hustle, the more valuable I think I am.
Yeah, because
Oh
we
dear.
value ourselves by our activity,
Mm-hmm.
the amount of activity.
Yes. Yes. And it's a culture thing, I think.
Mm,
I
yeah,
see it everywhere around me.
and I don't actually think it's just a Western culture thing. My Asian friends would probably say the same. Obviously, religions like Buddhism encourage you to slow down, but there's lots of really busy Asians, and people in the subcontinent, um, and I can't speak for Africa. I can't, um, but I think it's more than just a white Western culture. This idea of
Hmm.
busyness, I think it seems to be a human condition, and but there is another way, and I
Hmm.
actually think that's because this organic way of doing things is not confined solely to women, but it is a more feminine energy way of doing things, because men, there's men who do business this way or work this way. But I think it's about understanding that feminine energy way of doing things is as valid as the masculine. The masculine has its place too. Like the masculine energy has got us this far in the world, and we can't take away from all the huge and wonderful achievements that humankind has made. But there is another way.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Hmm. And I know you've done a lot of work on bias.
Yes.
And let's talk about that a bit.
Okay. Now, interestingly, when I first started my business, I called my business Backstory Consultancy because I loved the idea of what about the backstories of our lives?
Mm-hmm.
What has happened in our lives that has brought us to where we are, but not only that, but has shaped our thinking. Now, it wasn't until I went to Nauru and started to, well, mix with people who were not white. Like I grew up in very white Australia. Everybody looked like me, sounded like me, thought like me. And so here I go to this little tiny Pacific island where it's Pacific Islanders, and then the asylum seekers were from the Middle East and Sri Lanka. So,
Mm-hmm.
lots of different languages, all skin colours of varying shades of brown and black. The only white people were the people who were imported to work there, like me. Um, and so I was confronted with a very different situation. And I realised because of just a bit of fear that I was feeling, even though I was physically safe, I was feeling anxious in the camp. Like, yeah, obviously it was a very strange environment. And I reflected on, well, gosh, why am I feeling afraid when I'm physically safe? And I recognised that somewhere along the line, I'd been taught that difference was a threat. When you grow up in a monocultural environment, anybody who's different is wrong.
Mm-hmm.
And so that led me to think, okay, well, maybe the woman who said she didn't have a racist bone in her body actually does have a latent racism purely from my upbringing. That I'd
Mm-hmm.
absorbed this idea that difference was a threat. Once I'd come to that realization, I also knew that I could change that. Like, I actually don't believe I can ever eliminate my tendency to have a racist bias because it's just ingrained in my thinking from a child. But because I know it now, I can choose how I respond to when I feel that bias coming up. And what I did was I flipped it on its head. So rather than seeing difference as a threat, I now see difference as an asset. And I choose to do that. It's
Mm-hmm.
intentional. That's one of the things I've learned about our biases. They are part of how we think. I sometimes describe them as part of our psychological DNA, and it's not just a white thing. Every human being on the planet has biases. We learn, um, as children, who to
Mm-hmm.
trust because of, they belong to a particular group, or who not to
Mm-hmm.
trust because they're different to us, on a whole range of things. And we learn these, what we consider to be truths, by osmosis from our parents, from our schools, from the media, from our sports clubs, and they become part of our thinking long before we have the cognitive ability to make a choice and go, oh, I'm not sure that that's right. But as adults, as we become aware of our biases, we can choose to either continue down the path of allowing them to shape us, or to go, no, I actually don't believe that. I don't want that. That doesn't fit with how I see myself, because I certainly didn't see myself as racist. I don't want to see myself that way. I don't want to act that way. I don't want to think that way. So I get to choose. So that's the work I've been doing around bias. I wanted to normalize the conversation, because unfortunately, when we raise the concept of unconscious bias, people get really defensive. Oh, I'm not racist, I'm not sexist, I'm not ageist. Well, actually, yes, we all are. We
Yes, we
all
are.
have this. We all have this. I can do it as an older person. I can do it to younger people. I can I can do it to people who have a different skin color to me. Um, I can do it to people who have a disability, even though I've worked with people with disabilities. It doesn't actually matter what our life experience has been, we can still have these biases. And one of the best quotes that I'd heard was from Siegel Barsaid, and she's a management professor at the University of Pennsylvania. She said, "You can be the most consciously unbiased progressive thinker and still
Mm-hmm.
have unconscious biases that do not align with your beliefs." I loved that. I thought, gosh, here we are. We can have our unconscious biases over here. We can have our beliefs over here, and they don't necessarily match up. And Roger
Mm-hmm.
J. Davies, who's a professor of linguistics, he says he sees biases like a parallel world to rational and logical thought. So that you've got your biases going over here, you've got your logical thought here, which we all think we're nice and logical and reasonable, but hello, under the surface, we've got our biases and they coexist. So it's about understanding this, knowing that's part of the complexity of us as human beings. But as we understand this, we can mitigate the risks that come with bias that is not addressed and owned.
Mm-hmm.
Because we do risk relationships. We risk making bad decisions or poor decisions. We could make better decisions.
Mm-hmm.
In the workplace, we can risk not actually having the best people in roles because we've chosen somebody who's just like us rather than
Yes.
broadening out our perspective on things.
So, Bron, how can we help ourselves become more aware of our biases?
Oh, I love that question. Uh, as I reflected on my time in Nauru and how I did this process, I realised I'd actually done four things. The first one was to notice the triggers or the cues. Now, for me, it was when I walked on that first day into the camp. It's 400 men, all speaking different languages. I knew most of them were Muslim, and I'd come from a Christian background, all different skin colours, and my stomach's churning, my shoulders are tensing. So my body was telling me something. And I think that's a good cue. Listen to your
Mm-hmm.
body. What's your body saying? Are you finding yourself getting physically tense, or the stomach churning? We can also have emotional cues as well. When we get frustrated or angry with someone's words or attitudes, that can also go like be a cue that goes, what's going on here? Why am I responding? And that's the second step, is to then ask the questions. What is going on here? That's what I ask myself. Why am I feeling afraid when I'm physically safe? Because questions are key to working with our biases. Questions, we are curious. They open up our thinking. They don't close our thinking down. And then the third step is, once we start asking ourselves questions, we can then go, okay, what are the stories that I've learnt around this situation from my
Mm-hmm.
childhood, particularly? And that's where I realised that even though my family is not overtly racist at all, I had learnt that difference was a threat. And I'll just give you a really funny little example. Strong Protestant household, um, and the two girls, myself and my sister, at different times wanted to get our ears pierced. Mum wouldn't let us because only Catholic girls get their ears pierced.
Oh.
Now, for me, Protestant Catholic made no sense, but for my mother, that was quite a big divide. And so, even little innocuous things like this tell me that difference is wrong. It is wrong for me to have my ears pierced because I'm not a Catholic. So, these
Mm-hmm.
were the little, as I said, quite innocuous, harmless in themselves, but they build up a pattern, they build up a story around, for me, difference is a threat. And then we can name the bias out of that. In that situation, when I saw that I was mixing with races of people that were different to me, as I did that four-step process, I came to the uncomfortable realization that I had a racist bias that I didn't know was there. And then have to own it. That's probably the fifth step, is to own it.
Mm-hmm.
Brene Brown says one of the most courageous things we can do is to own our story and love ourselves through the process. So I had to own my racist bias, own where it came from, know that my parents did not intentionally teach me to be racist and would have been horrified if I'd ever mentioned that to them. But that was the reality. And this was now part of my life, and I need to live with that. I cannot say I'm no longer racist because I can't. It's not just not true.
Mm-hmm.
But now that I know
Mm-hmm.
this, I can work with it.
Yes. And the first thing you said, the quote that you mentioned, um, is so, it's shifting that guilt and that weight. Um, because if we just can accept that the two, our beliefs and our biases, can coexist, and we just need to take a good look at both to be aware. Yeah, this is, ooh, um, that's hopeful,
It
you
is
know?
hopeful, yes, and I'm glad you used that word because that is always my goal. Like I'm the glass half full girl. The eternal optimist, despite the little voices in my head that will catastrophize. Um, but I am, and I because I do. I suppose I believe in the capacity of human beings to grow and
Hmm.
change because I've done that myself, and I do always believe um, in the deep goodness of human beings, despite often what we see on the news. But then you know that that's just a small percentage of the population who are doing rather nasty things. But yet, to allow us to be hopeful, we don't have to stay where we are. We can grow,
Hmm.
we can change. And I think it's part of maturing as an adult, that we look at, the shadow side, the dark side, and accept it. But what I've also found interesting, and maybe this just comes back to my nature, is that I don't see that I have any monsters lurking within me. Yes, there are things that I have learnt, that I've absorbed, that are my biases, but I'm not a monster. And I don't believe other
Hmm.
people are monsters either. I don't believe there are any monsters lurking deep within that we need to just shut the door and hope they will go away. Yes, there are things that are less than optimum in our lives, but
Hmm. Hmm.
we can choose. We can always be intentional about what we do with the things that we maybe prefer weren't part of our lives, but they are. So let's just get on with it and work with it.
Everything we've talked about today, um, if I had to draw it, it would be a person walking forward and finding out, um, becoming more self-aware and evolving and having the courage to do all of these things. So it's a very dynamic image, um, and a very hopeful one, and it has a root to our power, in our
Yes.
power. And this fills me with, um, yes, again, optimism and yeah, and strength.
Oh, that's wonderful. That is so good. As you were talking about your image, I can remember the first 4 weeks that I spent on Nauru. I felt as though I was like the TARDIS, out of Doctor Who. Looks like this ordinary telephone box. You open the door and you go inside, and the capacity inside is huge. That's what I felt like I
Uh-huh.
was. I was like the TARDIS. Bron was still the same on the outside, but inside my internal capacity had enlarged hugely. And I think that it's that sense of enlargement that is available to all of us. I think I come back to that, saying that we are more powerful and stronger than we have any idea about. That's because inside we are bigger than we know. And I learnt
Hmm.
that for myself. I understood. I'm like the TARDIS. I'm bigger on the inside than I am on the outside.
Wow. That's so, so beautiful. Um, I think we can. I'm thinking that what you just said is a wonderful way to end this conversation because it's so so bright and powerful and wonderful.
Oh, thank you. I have certainly, this has been a wonderful conversation. I have loved speaking with you.
uh, I think that this conversation will mm, land on some people that really, really need to hear these things. And that makes me happy. Thank you very, very much for everything you've shared, for sharing your experiences and your wisdom. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, Aspasia. It has just been delightful.
Thank you for listening to the Theorem podcast. Connect with me on social media at Aspasia Provu and at theorem.podcast and share your thoughts. You may support us on Patreon. Visit the website aspasiaprovu.com/theorem for more. Τα λέμε σύντομα. Meaning talk to you soon in Greek. Aspasia's Theorem podcast does not provide advice, medical or any other kind. It just presents the opinions of its host and guests. If you have any specific problems, please visit your physician or a medical expert for help. Anything said should not be taken as a replacement for medical, clinical, or professional advice, diagnosis, or medical intervention. The episodes of Aspasia's Theorem podcast may, at times, cover sensitive topics including, but not limited to, mental health, nutrition, health, politics, spirituality, alternative medicine, energy healing, and the use of plant medicines. You're advised to refrain from continuing if you are adversely impacted by any of these topics.